I'm Hunter Allen, and this is Nietzsche on free will and amor fati as a solution to a lack of free will. This is my final video presentation for Philosophy 3090, Friedrich Nietzsche. To begin the presentation, we will go over a basic outline of the whole. We will begin with a basic paradox within Nietzsche and understand it. Then we're going to work in how Nietzsche interprets free will and how he rejects some ideologies and accepts others. We will then explore the idea of personal fatalism within Nietzsche and how it can aid in becoming oneself. Then we'll also use another analogy about a gardener to understand how to become oneself and love oneself. And then we will finish by discussing amor fati as a whole within Nietzsche. As I discussed on the last slide, we will start by going over the basic paradox within Nietzsche, and it goes as follows. According to Nietzsche, we are fated to be as we are, and yet also according to Nietzsche, we can create ourselves and make ourselves into something new. The paradox as a whole is quite simple to understand in these terms. However, I attempt to describe how this isn't actually a paradox. Rather, we can use both ideas together in a cohesive manner to describe how we can love our fate and also better become oneself. To expand more on the paradox from the previous slide, we will now explore two types of free will. That's desert and agency free will. We will also discuss going forward how Nietzsche accepts agency free will and denies desert free will. Writers who focus on desert free will are typically exercised by such questions as whether determinism precludes free will, thereby undercutting all ascriptions of desert. Where desert free will is an issue, the question of whether having done such and such one could have done otherwise is typically seen as being crucial. The institution here is that if one could not have done otherwise, then one should not be punished or rewarded for that one has done. And to expand on agency free will, according to the second approach, the free will debate is intrinsically tied to the question of agency. What constitutes an action as opposing to a mere doing? For simplicity of reference, we might describe the notion of free will relevant to this approach as agency free will. Writers who focus on agency free will are typically exercised by questions such as what makes for autonomy. To expand further, desert free will also requires a moral obligation that requires then a punishment or reward to be done in response. However, the agency free will refers closer to how, as agents as ourselves, we can respond to our capacity to act upon our own agency. Now to look at the two within Nietzsche's works as a whole. To interpret Nietzsche as an opponent of desert free will, because he rejects cause sway free will. Desert's free will is to emphasize a purely negative aspect, his hostility to Judeo-Christian notions of responsibility and punishment. This undoubtedly is an important and oft-repeated theme in Nietzsche's work. To interpret Nietzsche as giving a positive naturalist account of agency, free will is to emphasize a positive and original aspect. His notion that under the right conditions, genuine agency, a truly great achievement, is possible, albeit only for a special few. Furthermore, this interpretation helps us to properly appreciate the famous passage in Gay Science 125, where Nietzsche's madman tells us that we must ourselves become God to be worthy of the deed of killing God. To become gods is to be autonomous, self-legislators, who are not subservient to some external authority, be it a god, the summum bonum, or allegedly universal moral law. In Nietzsche's work, he interprets desert free will directly to the Judeo-Christian, which he has on repeated occasions rejected, and because he views it, he also views it a part of the European and Christian morality of the time, which we know he has rejected critically. Agency free will, on the other hand, more aligns itself with other ideas within Nietzsche, such as the Urmensch and free spirit, where we can see that he has a true love for these types of people and would much rather align himself with these, and thus agency free will is the interpretation that we will operate under going forward. Now moving on to a separate idea within Nietzsche and one interpretation of that idea. The details are fascinating, of course. But for our purposes, what is significant is that the self-deceived inventors of virtue are redescribing their essence, their effects, their sole, intellectual, irremovable reality. They are redescribing as some willed, chosen, the hard granite-like core of necessity in them that is beyond revision or reform, or therefore choice. They are, in short, deceiving themselves about their fate. We can be confident then that personal fatalism runs deep for Nietzsche. It matters to him at bottom, each of us have a natural that is fixed, an essence even. To expand on the idea of personal fatalism within Nietzsche, we have this granite-like core within each of us, something that cannot be changed, something that is a part of us at its core. This is our fate, to, to say quite frankly. Our fate as a whole, there are some things that we cannot change. For example, we cannot change where we are from, we cannot change who our parents are, but some of these parts make us who we are. But that is not to say that there are parts of us that are outside of the scope that cannot be changed overall. This is only a single part of it, and we will expand on this idea further to see how we can use this fate within ourselves and contradict that with the parts of us that we can change. This slide and the next both expand on the gardener analogy, which I think is crucial to understanding this idea as a whole. A gardener can cultivate a beautiful fruit tree on a trellis. In order to do this, the gardener needs to know quite a lot. He must indeed be a student of nature, a learner, a discoverer of what is lawful and necessary in things. For example, he must know about roots, stocks, and grafting, about manuring without over-manuring, about pruning and training, about pests and diseases. He must know that a pear tree but not a plum tree can be grown on an espalier, that a morello cherry but not a fig will tolerate a north-facing wall, that its growth can be curbed in an apple tree by bark ringing, but that this will not harm a peach or any other tree whose fruit contains stones. He must know the difference between primary and secondary branches, between leaders and laterals, between spurs and flower buds and wood buds, and he must be able to tailor his knowledge to take into account the idiosyncrasies of individual plants, special soil types, local climates, and particular aspects of a given site. His task is, in other words, a highly expert one. To begin here with the gardener analogy, we will expand on this idea further, however, that we must become experts in our own field, upon ourselves, about everything around us. We have to be able to interpret everything around us to then grow more knowledgeable, to then act upon that. Without this act of knowledge upon us, there's nothing we can do. We are just acting blindly, which, however, is no way to cultivate and become oneself. However, we must understand everything around us to then act on it. Expanding on the gardener analogy even more, I've labored the horticultural side of Nietzsche's analogy because it seems to me to bring out the main points very cleverly. Self-creation in Nietzsche's view is made possible by our learning and discovering about environmental facts, about species and subspecies facts, and about facts particular to ourselves. It depends upon our being able to distinguish between the facts that is beyond our power to change, facts which we can modify, or whose effects we can ameliorate, and facts whose obtaining is up to us and is successful. Our achievements may be radical. We may make of ourselves something beautiful and cultured rather than wild or raw, and this despite the constraints that our environment, species, and personal idiosyncrasies must inevitably impose. And if we do succeed, however, our achievements will be fragile, and fragile in exactly the same sense that the gardener's achievement is fragile. We ourselves have to become the gardener of ourselves and everything around us. We have to be wary of all these outside stressors that are imposed upon us and everything within ourselves. Once we can do that, we can start to grow the plant. We can start to be able to grow what we want to out of ourselves. But we have to begin by understanding ourselves and everything around us to then act upon it again. This also further expands on Nietzsche's naturalism. However, we will not be discussing that today or in this presentation because it is outside the scope, but it is to note that it does expound on that idea. To get the same idea as before with the gardener, we can look at another description from Solomon, however not in the book provided to us through the class. One becomes what one is. And if one believes, as I think anyone not blinded by ideology or an empty humanism must believe, that we are all talented and limited in different ways, then it more or less follows that we are free to develop our talents, free that insofar we have the talents, but we are not free regarding what talents we have and therefore what talents we might choose to develop. What more, the notion that talents are given and not chosen admits to our complication as well. We might say that one simply cannot choose to have a talent, but one does not always know whether or not one has a talent. And in most disciplines, one can develop some approximation of talent, even without having it. Internal blocks to development may consist of a clash of talents and an inability to choose among them. It may also consist of a refusal to recognize that one has a talent, but the most interesting difficulties in cultivating a talent are due to what I call a meta-talent, a talent for pursuing one's talents. Solomon, much in the same way as the gardener, work upon the same idea. We have to know what our talents are intrinsically to us, the ones that we are born with, the ones that we come naturally to us. Once we know this, we can then act upon them. However, he is also arguing that there are some talents that we can build that are outside of those naturally given to us. And this is true, we can see it in everyday life. However, those meta talents that we can develop, we have to develop our meta talent, a talent for pursuing one's own talent. We have to be able to see within ourselves and understand what in ourselves we can manipulate and control. Then we can actually act upon them and become a better one of oneself. We have to be able to see and manipulate what is in oneself to become better. Finally, we move to amor fati as a solution to the whole. From Ecce Homo, Nietzsche states, my formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be other than it is, not in the future, not in the past, not in all eternity. That is to love one's fate. Now to expand on the idea further from a different point of view. Nietzsche's point here is a deep one, and it applies to creativity across the board. What he says is certainly true of the gardener, and his own analogy makes clear, but it is also true of the painter who must learn to harness the nature or fate of his pigments, of the poet who must turn the grammar of his language to account, of the sculptor who must work with the grain of the marble, of the composer who must make the most of the human ear, of the urban architect who must exploit the lines of the buildings he cannot knock down. For all these, amor fati is the indispensable motto, and if Nietzsche thought that self-creation is plausible, then it is too for all that those who would seek to better themselves, to cultivate themselves, to make their character something beautiful and productive. Amor fati is loving one's own fate and becoming who you are as the part of who you are. We have to look at that not just within ourselves. We have to love the fate of everything around us, as the painter loves the pigments that he works with. Everyone has to love those parts that they work within as a whole. We have to love ourselves. We have to love what is given to us, the things we cannot manipulate. And going forward, this is what we have to do. We have to love the parts that are unmanipulatable about us and work outside of that. As a whole, it all comes together. Some parts of us are fated to be the way that they are, but that does not stop us. Going back to that original paradox, we have to bring it all together. Those parts of us that are fated to be the way they are, we can also manipulate the other parts around it. We have to understand what is fated and what is not to be able to better ourselves as a whole. Thank you.